An ordinary grocery trip takes an unforgettable turn when an elderly woman tells rapper Snoop Dogg to go back to Africa. What happens next isn't just a mic drop. It's a cultural earthquake. Don't miss this. Like, subscribe, and comment for more stories that shake the world. The grocery store buzzed with the usual hum of daily errands. Shoppers pushed their carts through the aisles, some lost in thought, others chatting quietly. It was a sunny afternoon in Compton, California, a city that shaped Snoop Dogg's roots. But today, the routine flow of life would be disrupted in the most unexpected way. Near the produce section, an elderly woman named Mrs. Thompson, likely in her late 70s, stood adjusting her glasses. Her movements were deliberate, her impatience evident as she muttered under her breath while reaching for a bag of apples. With her faded cardigan and neatly pinned silver hair, she appeared unassuming, but what unfolded next was anything but. Snoop Dogg, dressed in his signature laid-back style, a blue Compton hoodie and jeans, approached the same stand, casually reaching for a bag of oranges. He moved with an effortless cool, his calm demeanor blending seamlessly into the store's atmosphere. Balancing a basket of groceries in one hand, he was texting on his phone with the other when it happened. Mrs. Thompson turned sharply, her eyes locking onto Snoop. Her expression shifted noticeably. It wasn't subtle. Her eyes narrowed, and her lips tightened as a wave of disapproval flickered across her face. Her lips pursed tightly, and her voice rang out, cutting through the hum of the store. "You people don't belong here," she said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Snoop froze, his fingers hovering over his phone. When he looked up, her words continued, sharper and more biting. "Why don't you go back to Africa where you came from?" The air in the store seemed to thicken. A couple of shoppers nearby stopped in their tracks, exchanging uneasy glances, while others pretended not to hear. The rhythm of the store halted, replaced by an awkward silence that stretched far too long. Snoop's initial reaction was shock. His brow furrowed, and for a moment it seemed he might reply instantly. But he didn't. Instead, he took a slow, measured breath, his face unreadable as though he was carefully considering every possible response. Mrs. Thompson, still clutching her bag of apples, stood her ground. Unapologetic and firm, her posture radiated defiance. The tension in the air was palpable, and everyone within earshot could feel it. A young mother named Elena quickly steered her child away, whispering something soothing to distract him. An older man near the potatoes, Mr. Ramirez, glanced nervously at Snoop, his eyes flicking between him and Mrs. Thompson, waiting to see what would happen. The silence was heavier than any words, setting the stage for a moment that felt like it could shatter at any second. For what felt like an eternity, Snoop stood perfectly still, his hand gripping the handle of his grocery basket. The world around him seemed to shrink. The usual store noises faded to a muffled hum. Every face had turned in his direction, the weight of Mrs. Thompson's words lingering in the air like an unshakable shadow. Mrs. Thompson didn't waver. Her stance remained firm, her chin tilted upward in a way that dared him to respond. She adjusted her cardigan with a huff, as if punctuating her statement. A few feet away, Marcus, a young employee stacking bananas, froze mid-motion. His eyes darted between the two, his hands gripping a bunch of fruit, unsure whether to intervene or stay invisible. The store held its collective breath, awaiting Snoop's next move. Marcus, still holding the bananas, hesitated, unsure whether to step in or stay out of it. A cashier named Lisa craned her neck to get a better view of the escalating tension. The growing crowd didn't move closer, but they didn't leave either. Like it or not, they had become witnesses. Snoop glanced at Mrs. Thompson, his face calm, though his eyes betrayed deep thought. 1,000 possible responses raced through his mind. He could lash out, yell, or walk away. But none of those options felt right. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, but instead of crumbling, he let himself breathe. He shifted his basket to his other hand, straightened his posture, and seemed to grow larger within the silence. His voice, when it finally came, was calm yet deliberate, cutting through the awkward tension like a knife. "Ma'am," he began, his tone measured and steady, "do you even realize what you just said?" The question wasn't hostile. It was reflective, almost as though he were offering her a chance to reconsider. But Mrs. Thompson didn't waver. "I said what I said," she snapped, her voice rising in defiance. "This is my country. People like you don't belong here." That was it. A young woman near the bread aisle, Jessica, gasped audibly, and the quiet murmur of the crowd grew louder. Yet Snoop remained composed. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't step closer. Instead, he allowed the silence to stretch, giving her words time to sink into the ears of everyone around. Finally, he nodded slowly, his calm demeanor disarming, almost unsettling in its strength. "All right," he said, his tone deliberate. "Let's talk about that, since you brought it up." The room held its collective breath. A storm was brewing, but it wasn't the kind anyone expected. With deliberate care, Snoop shifted his weight and set his basket down on the floor. His calmness was magnetic, drawing the attention of even those pretending not to listen. He fixed his gaze on Mrs. Thompson, not with anger, but with a quiet determination that made her shift uncomfortably. "You said I don't belong here," he began, his voice steady, each word carrying weight. "But let me tell you something about where I come from." The crowd leaned in, the air thick with anticipation. Snoop's words weren't just a response, they were a lesson, a reckoning, and a challenge. Each word Snoop spoke felt carefully chosen, weighted with purpose. "My great-great-grandfather was born right here in California," he said, his tone steady but resolute. "But before that, my ancestors were brought here against their will, worked like animals to build this state, this country you're standing in." Mrs. Thompson's lips tightened, but she said nothing. The crowd, however, was riveted. A man near the dairy section, Tom, lowered his phone, his attention fully captured. An older couple, the Wilsons, whispered quietly to each other but didn't look away. "My grandfather," Snoop continued, his voice growing stronger, "fought in Korea. He fought for a country that sent him to war but wouldn't give him equal rights when he came back. Couldn't sit at the same counters. Couldn't drink from the same fountains. But he stayed. You know why?" He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Because he believed in this country's promise, even when it didn't believe in him." The store was silent now, even the hum of the refrigerators seeming to fade. "And my parents," he went on, his tone softening but losing none of its intensity, "they fought too, not with guns or fists, but by being who they are. They raised me to respect everyone, no matter what they look like. My mother's a teacher. She spent her entire life educating kids about love and equality. My father? He's a community leader, the kind of man who would stop on the side of the road to help someone like you if your car broke down." His gaze remained fixed on Mrs. Thompson, his words deliberate, unwavering. "So you're telling me I don't belong here? That I should go back to Africa?" Snoop shook his head slightly, his voice now tinged with sadness. "Ma'am, I am as much a part of this country as you are. Maybe even more, because my family paid the price for it in blood, sweat, and tears." Mrs. Thompson's face flushed, her hands trembling as she clutched her apples. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but no words came out. They caught in her throat, silenced by the gravity of what she had heard. Snoop took a step back, his composure unshaken. Addressing the entire crowd now, he said, "I could have walked away, but what good would that do? Ignorance doesn't get better in silence. It's up to all of us to be better than this, to be better than words like those." His voice carried a finality that left the room in a deep hush. The weight of his words lingered, heavy and undeniable. The story, however, wasn't over. The crowd's reaction would speak louder than anything else. The silence that followed was electric, charged with the possibility of change, or the failure to embrace it. After Snoop's words, the silence was almost deafening. For a moment, no one moved. Mrs. Thompson's face was a mosaic of emotions: anger, embarrassment, and something deeper, something that looked almost like shame. Her eyes darted around the crowd, searching for an ally, but none came. A middle-aged man wearing a baseball cap, Derek, stepped forward. "He's right," Derek said, breaking the quiet. "We've got to be better than this." His words seemed to shatter the tension. An older woman near the frozen foods aisle, Mrs. Garcia, nodded. "My dad fought in that same war," she said softly, her voice trembling. "He always said the only color that mattered was the red on the flag." The murmurs began to grow. A young cashier, no older than 20, named Ava, called out from her station, "I've never seen anyone handle something like that so gracefully. Thank you." Mrs. Thompson, now visibly flustered, clutched her cart tightly. She didn't apologize, but the fire in her eyes had dimmed. When she finally spoke, Her voice was quieter, almost pleading. "I didn't mean." But she stopped herself. Snoop turned back to her, his expression softer now. "It's not about what you meant," he said gently. "It's about how it came across. Words matter. Actions matter even more." From the deli counter, James, a tall man with a calm demeanor, began to clap. It was slow and hesitant at first, but soon others joined in. The sound swelled, filling the store with something undeniable. A recognition, not just of Snoop's words, but of the courage it took to confront hate with dignity. Mrs. Thompson looked around one last time, her face pale. Without another word, she wheeled her cart toward the exit. As she left, a few people moved to thank Snoop. One woman, Tanya, placed a hand on his shoulder. "Thank you," she said simply, "for saying what needed to be said." Snoop smiled faintly, lifting his basket back into his hand. "Sometimes," he said almost to himself, "it's not about winning or losing. It's about making sure people hear the truth." The crowd slowly dispersed, the tension replaced by a reflective quiet. Some looked inspired, others thoughtful, but everyone seemed changed in some small way. The moment had passed, but the impact of Snoop's words lingered, reverberating beyond the walls of the grocery store. As people returned to their routines, the atmosphere felt different, quieter, more introspective. Snoop finished his shopping, his steps measured, processing everything that had just unfolded. The weight of the moment hadn't shaken him, but it had left him reflective. At the checkout line, Ava, the young cashier, scanned his items with a shy smile. "What you said back there," she hesitated, then continued, "it meant a lot. People don't always stand up like that, especially with such grace." Snoop smiled back, his tone warm. "Sometimes grace is the only way to break through anger," he said. "Anger just builds walls." Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the parking lot. As Snoop walked to his car, he noticed Mrs. Thompson sitting in hers, gripping the steering wheel tightly. For a moment, he thought about walking over to her, but decided against it. Some lessons take time to settle, and he had already said what needed to be said. Later that evening, Snoop sat with some of his crew at his home in Compton, recounting the events of the day. The day's events lingered in the air as Snoop recounted the story to his friends. They listened intently, nodding in agreement. "You did the right thing, Snoop," Leroy, one of his close friends, said finally. "Not just for yourself, but for everyone who was watching. People like her. They might not change overnight, but you planted a seed. That's all you can do sometimes, plant the seed and let it grow." Snoop nodded, Leroy's words resonating deeply. He realized that while the encounter had been uncomfortable, it was necessary. Ignorance doesn't change unless it's confronted, and silence only allows it to fester. Across town in West Compton, Mrs. Thompson sat at her dining table, staring at the untouched plate of food before her. Snoop's words replayed in her mind, each one cutting through the armor of her long-held assumptions. She thought of her own grandchildren, of the world they were growing up in, and for the first time, she felt a pang of something unfamiliar: doubt. In the days that followed, the story of what had happened at the grocery store spread through the neighborhood. People talked about Snoop's response, his courage, and the dignity with which he handled the situation. It became more than just an incident. It became a lesson, a reminder of the power of words and the importance of standing up for what's right. Snoop didn't seek attention for what he'd done, but his actions rippled through the community in unexpected ways. Strangers approached him with gratitude, sharing their own stories of prejudice and resilience. His quiet stand had sparked conversations that had long been avoided, breaking the silence around uncomfortable truths. Mrs. Thompson, too, began to change. It wasn't immediate, but she started to question the beliefs she had clung to for so long. She thought about the weight of her words and the pain they could inflict. She didn't know if she'd ever see Snoop again, but if she did, she hoped she'd have the courage to apologize. Moments like these remind us of the power of kindness, strength, and truth in the face of ignorance. They teach us that standing up doesn't always mean shouting. It can mean speaking calmly with conviction and letting the truth do the rest. To everyone watching, let this be a reminder. Small actions rooted in dignity and courage can spark change that echoes far beyond the moment. Sometimes, all it takes is one voice to remind us of who we are and who we can be. Your words and actions matter. They have the power to hurt or heal, to divide or unite. If this story moved you, let it inspire you to be better, to stand up and speak out for justice, understanding, and compassion. Disclaimer: all stories shared on this channel are entirely fictional and created for entertainment purposes. We advocate for a world where everyone enjoys equal rights under the law and where society continues to evolve in fairness, progress, and unity. Our goal is to share heartwarming tales that inspire and contribute to making life better. Any resemblance to real events, individuals, or organizations is purely coincidental and unintentional. These stories are not intended to reference actual people, events, or entities, and contain no political or religious connotations.